Hello, my name's Ryan Mercer and welcome to Build Back Liberal. Back in June, shortly before the Lib Dem leadership election, Layla Moran published Build Back Better, a booklet with contributions from over 40 Liberal Democrat supporters exploring progressive policy ideas for the post-COVID world. For me, Build Back Better is part of an ongoing debate in our party about what it means to govern a country as Liberals. This series will continue that debate, helping to develop a progressive centre-left agenda for the Liberal Democrats. To do this, I'll be interviewing some of the contributors to Build Back Better about their ideas and asking where we need to go next as a party. In this first episode, I'm joined by Paul Noblet. Paul worked for a number of years as party press officer before his election to Southwark Council, where he served as a cabinet member. Since then, he spent the last decade in the third sector, working with charities on tackling homelessness. Hello, Paul.
Hi.
Could you tell us a bit more about yourself and how you came to be a Liberal Democrat and that sort of thing?
Well, in a way, I was sort of born into certainly being a Liberal. I remember when I was about 8 or 9 years old in the 1987 District Council elections in North Wiltshire, going around with my dad. Well, I'd hold the clipboard and he'd do the talking, trying to win a district council seat, which eventually he won a town council seat. But certainly that was my sort of formative years. And going off to university in 1997, obviously just after the Blair landslide, I think I was one of a minority of students at university who wasn't very pro New Labour, and I had the fortune to be taught in one of my history classes in my first year by the late Conrad Russell, Lord Russell, Earl Russell. So I kind of got a bit of a grounding in not only how to try and win seats, but also in maybe some of the party traditions, I guess, over those years. And then I guess in terms of post-university, I worked in the party's press office for 6 years, so the 2001 and 2005 general elections, which were obviously a fantastic time to be a Liberal Democrat with late Charles Kennedy's leadership and working with people like Min Campbell and Simon Hughes. And then got elected to Southwark Council, representing a ward that obviously Simon Hughes as a local MP had represented for many years. And I think that was a fantastic grounding in, I guess, getting to know and trying to help and support constituents who were very diverse in their backgrounds. Some people were from families who hadn't really worked full time since the closure of the docks in London in the 70s. And other people were living in the slightly more luxury flats across alongside the river, across the river from Canary Wharf. So kind of trying to come up with Liberal Democrat solutions which both tackle sort of poverty and unemployment, but also then looking at issues which work for people who maybe are working in very middle class office jobs, who had different needs and different views. Was quite a grounding in both politics and policy, I suppose.
So, Build Back Better, how did you come to be involved and why do you think this is such an important piece of work?
Well, I came to be involved in it, I think largely because I chaired 18 months ago the A Fairer Share for All working group, which reported back to the Federal Policy Committee and, of course, ultimately, as we do in this party, to Federal Conference. And what A Fairer Share for All looked at was effectively how can you tackle poverty? And that was twofold. That was one about how could you get income into people's pockets faster, and then how could you look at maybe reducing some of the costs of living, so kind of getting those things to meet in the middle. So really looking at not just the cost of living, but more accurately probably the affordability of living. And we looked at universal credit, we looked at lifelong learning, we looked at food poverty and how you could tackle food banks, and trying to work out just how do you balance things like whether it's getting enough money into people's pockets through minimum wages or universal credits in the benefit system, but also how do you reduce costs? How do you look at, can we get energy more cheaply? Can we get housing which is more affordable? What attitude as a party should we come to about how accessible and affordable broadband provision is? So that's kind of how I came to be involved. We'd done some of the work around that, and it was a fantastic team that were on the working group. And in terms of, I think, why Build Back Better is so important is, I think it does two things. One is it looks well beyond the immediate, and I think that's really important, because whilst we're all looking at ways in day jobs and elsewhere through the party to make sure that particularly the most vulnerable people in society have the support they need during the pandemic, I think it's really important to kind of say we can't go back to normal, because normal didn't work for many people. And so taking that long-term view, really important. I think the second thing is that perhaps Build Back Better was able to look holistically across the piece and across different public policy areas in a way that something like Federal Policy Committee doesn't have the resources to do. We have lots of policy, of course, in many areas, as we all know. And if we had as many seats as we do policies, we'd be in majorities forevermore. But the crucial thing with this was looking at, if you have a response to climate change, how can that drive employment? And are all those jobs the jobs of now or the jobs of the future? How many of those may be automated? In that case, what does that mean for employment levels, for the skills people will need, particularly young people? And so looking across the piece was a really important thing to maybe inject ideas into the party, whilst the party's parliamentarians were very focused on not only leadership election, of course, but also in making sure constituents and the broader UK are supported through the pandemic.
So your chapter in this, can you outline sort of what that was about, what you're trying to get across in that chapter?
So the chapter I put together was kind of following on from A Fairer Share for All. It was looking at the issue of affordability of life. So one of the issues, of course, which many Liberal Democrats have become very interested in recently, and of course it came up in a motion at party conference in September, was the issue of universal basic income. Now, I have to confess that I was not completely sold on universal basic income when I was chairing the working group. In the final report, we said we're not persuaded that even all the evidence that's come out of places such as Finland and Alaska and cities in Canada and the rest of the United States doesn't quite, on the scale that we felt was appropriate for the UK, prove that it's the way to go. What we did, though, think in that report was that payment should be unconditional. And obviously that's quite a big break from the norm that's been in this country since the Second World War, is to say that effectively there is no need for an element of conditionality. And so the article I put together, the chapter I put together, was saying now might actually be the time to look at this, because I think of what the coronavirus has shown about where we are as a country. I think universal basic income, I think, is something that would have come 10 years down the line. I think looking at where types of employment are going, looking at there may be a reduced number of jobs, or people may not be required to do as many hours. We might be just trying to make those opportunities go around sort of a smaller and smaller group of people. Also thinking about, you know, what do we want society to look at? So one of the things there's obviously really been an increase in is a greater role for communities and for compassion within those communities. And it's something, as many people in the party who've been councillors and activists and all the rest of it, that's something that's very important to us, that grassroots support for one another and for local groups. That's something I think that UBI, again, would have had to respond to in 10 years' time, that greater need around caring, around looking after some of our natural environment, just giving people the opportunity to do more of that. Volunteering would have also been really important. So that's kind of what changed my mind between someone who was a little bit skeptical to saying, I think we should do this.
So in addition to universal basic income, one of the big themes in your section is about universal services and the need to provide a provision to everybody on a range of issues. Can you talk a bit more about that?
So in A Fairer Share for All, we kind of looked at universal access to basic services, and that was a way of emphasising that everyone needs access to affordable public transport, affordable housing, all those things that the party's talked about for a good number of years. What I said in the article was, rather than just have universal basic income as a way of putting more money into people's pockets unconditionally, maybe the way to make this both economically viable, but also politically sellable, is to say we need to balance a rise in income with universal basic services. So by that I mean, should we just give people for free access to water? You know, everyone agrees that you shouldn't be cut off from having access to fresh water because you can't pay the bills. So it sort of feels like the argument's won on that one already. But also looking at things like access to energy. Now, one of the things that is talked about in Build Back Better, and as a party we're excellent talking about, is about tackling climate change and introducing lots of renewable energy technology. And to bring the cost down of energy through sort of greener measures is one that I think makes something like universal free access to energy viable. Because if you're using more wind power, it's certainly one thing. Some people have said, well, you can't give people unlimited power because think of all those, all the gas or the coal or the nuclear power that's being burned. We shouldn't be encouraging that. But I think that people aren't necessarily going to leave the lights on much more than they do now. But equally, if we're getting it through renewable sources, it doesn't have that negative effect on the planet. So that was the second thing I argued for. Probably the third one, which was somewhat more controversial, and I know that there was some rolling of eyes among some people I spoke to in the party about it, was free access to broadband. And obviously we'd seen that in 2019, when Labour had their long shopping list of free giveaways at the election, that it didn't go down well with the British public because they felt this is going to cost an absolute fortune and how are you going to deliver it? And I focused on broadband for two reasons. One is that I think the last 6 months have shown us how much we need it for both work life, but also academic life as well, and people being able to be taught at home and access university courses increasingly from their room or from their home. But the second reason is how in touch it can keep people. And certainly I know with parents who are in their 70s that not being able to see them, but to be able to catch up with them every week on via the internet has been really important. And I think as we look towards particularly having an aging population, and so many people have moved away from where they grew up in order to find work, that having something like that free connection to broadband is a real levelling of the playing field. And I think as Liberal Democrats, that's something we can argue for and have a long tradition of making sure that people are not held back because they can't access something that's so central to modern life.
So this is one of the big debates in liberalism for a long time, is about universal services, universal benefits versus conditional benefits. And I think also there's a big economic question as well there around should what resource the state have be focused on those who are most disadvantaged and be really targeted, and also, you know, you go all the way back to Victorian times, we had this concept of the deserving poor and the undeserving poor, and we have this long ongoing tension about, you know, should we be giving everybody all these services when some people don't need them? Other people may be taking advantage of that generosity of the state. And how is it that why do you feel that universal services, universal benefits, universal income is more effective than being more targeted with more conditional approaches?
I think when it comes to the universal basic services, I think there's an argument, and I guess it's one where perhaps people who are more conservative minded would say, well, that's completely crazy. The state shouldn't just be enabling all of these things. If only everyone would go out and get a decent level of income through working hard, they'd be absolutely fine. And on the other side of the spectrum, you obviously get people who might say, well, let's have this long shopping list of services which should be free. I think that's why I focused around water, energy, and broadband, because thinking about what we already have as universal services, effectively health and education, to a degree housing, although obviously we could talk for a very long time about the lack of affordable housing in the country. But we've tended to move with the times. So when, starting off with the state pension under a Liberal government 100 years ago, because it said there is an argument that people who have been working all their lives, if they have no further ability through their age to earn an income, there is a responsibility of the state to provide that good. Then it evolved obviously through the health service and through state education earlier on to say these are public goods, because if you have educated, healthy citizens, generally that saves a lot of money down the line. It can help grow an economy. And I think water and energy and broadband, I think, fit those criteria. That it means that no one is left in poverty through a lack of being able to afford having to spend all of their money on a gas bill and to heat their home so they can't eat. I mean, that's a terrible trade-off. So I think that's why I'm in favour of them, but I think only for a focused group of services. I don't think we would want to go maybe beyond those three. There may be arguments for a couple of others here and there, and I'm sure people would come forward with those. But I think getting those as the foundational ones, they feel like they are on the one side sort of human rights for people to just be sustained. But then with the broadband, I think that's just because the technology, the need for technology has accelerated so quickly over the past 6 months, that I think it really is time to look at that. And I think actually if Jeremy Corbyn had been arguing for that alone on his shopping list in December 2020, I think he would have had a better hearing than arguing for universal broadband in December 2019.
I think there's a point there about with the broadband specifically, around that we increasingly use internet to access all these other services, and you can't actually access most government services, most council services of any kind without access through the internet. So there is also an access question there, as well as just about the social and human benefits of having access to the internet more broadly. I think one thing that always strikes me about this debate is a book called The Spirit Level, which came out about 10 years ago, which was really more a health study than anything else. It showed that in societies with more universal services, more equality of outcomes and basic provision, everybody was better off on a health basis in terms of particularly their mental health. And that if you have universal services, you have the risk of failure in life is lower, because if anything goes wrong, you have so much more to fall back on, and that actually reduces the stress levels of people right across society and leads to all sorts of positive outcomes, even if you're not the ones who actively need the provision on a day-to-day basis. It actually has a stabilizing effect on society more widely.
No, I agree, and I think it's funny that I think one of the things, my day job is working for a charity that supports young homeless people, and I think that combined with 8 years as a counsellor really puts you in mind of what people need to have is greater agency over their own lives. And I think as Liberals, we kind of exist to try and facilitate that. And I think the key word is that we try and facilitate things rather than do things to people. And I think, so it's about putting those building blocks in place. And I think if you do that, people do feel a greater sense of community and caring for one another. But they feel they can still do it in their own way as individuals. And I think that's a crucial thing to be looking to build at this point in time, probably more than any other time in the last 20 years. But I think the second thing I'd say is that a lot of people are put off by the cost of these things. And I think I think it's not as much an economic argument that needs to be made for a limited number of universal basic services and for a universal basic income, brackets set at an amount which is going to be useful to people. And, we might come on to that. But because I think at some point as a country, we forgot that if you want to have a society, you kind of have to be prepared to pay for the building blocks of that society. And, when I was writing the chapter, I went back and looked at the income tax rates for middle income earners through the 80s, the 90s, obviously that long Conservative government and the similarly long Labour government. And when Mrs. Thatcher resigned, the 25p in the pound was what middle earners paid on their income tax. Now, I appreciate that with many people unemployed at the moment, it's not going to be the most popular thing to argue for, to say, let's put everybody's income tax up. But I think there is a point about, if you look at the places who are, in Scandinavia, who are looking at some of the UBI, I mean, if you forget about the details of UBI and just say, what are they trying to create? And it's a more equal society, a happier society, a less stressed society that still continues to grow economically. I mean, it's not as though Finland has decided to give up completely and withdraw from the world. It's still making high-tech things. It's still chopping down trees and exporting timber. It's doing all of these things. But it's saying, who as a country do we want to be? Okay, how do we get there? Whereas I think a lot of the discussion around basic services and basic income come down to we can't possibly afford to pay for it. But, so I think it's very much a cultural change and a cultural argument rather than necessarily just an economic one.
I think you're right. And I think with UBI, there's a big conversation to be had with the costs and the affordability. And I think that conversation is often oversimplified to it will cost this much to give everybody this much money, and that's it. Rather than, if everybody had this much more money, where would the burdens be eased on other services? Where would that money be spent by people? We tend to know that money given to the poorest in society, or money given more broadly, tends to then be spent in the shops, tends to be actually reinvested in the economy, whereas money, tax cuts for the rich tend to be hoarded and saved, and so this force of money where it sticks together rather than trickles down. I think in terms of UBI, so we've had our party conference just 2 weeks ago, and from I think a year ago, where UBI was almost a fringe idea in the party, it was almost universally endorsed at party conference, with the only objections being this conversation about cost. And it was really quite striking, actually, in the leadership election, where both candidates ultimately came out for UBI. So this is clearly a direction the party's gone with. But one limitation that wasn't able to be addressed in the motion was about scale, the amount. And there's a huge range of possibility here. At one end of the spectrum, you have effectively everybody getting something equivalent to a state pension, essentially an amount that you could conceivably just about live on, even if you have nothing else. And at the other end, there's a kind of this is actually more of a supplement, a supporting allowance to life, rather than that everyone gets, rather than a fallback living allowance. And also a question about whether it is alone the main source of welfare in a country, or whether there are additional things that you can be eligible for given various range of circumstances. So what do you think about what the party's job next is to do in actually defining what we mean by our enthusiastic support for UBI?
Well, I was amazed about the scale of the enthusiasm when it came to the vote. I mean, I think I was muttering beforehand, you know, this is going to be a complete disaster if we don't vote for this. To see it passed in such an emphatic fashion was, I think, really important, and really important in terms of a statement to make sure that we keep all party members engaged and supporting the party, because, you know, as we've talked about, it's gone from it being quite a minority sport, being interested in UBI, to suddenly a lot of people have picked it up. And I think what's really important now, that it's not treated just as a almost as tokenism. Is my fear is that you know, I think both Layla and Ed spoke about it in many of the hustings in a slightly geeky way. I've watched quite a lot of the hustings, and I think people in the party think of it UBI in different ways. So I think some people think, well, the conditionality, the lack of conditionality is really the big thing for them. And certainly when we were doing a consultation at the spring conference a couple of years ago on a fairer share for all, the number of people who said, you know, we were claiming benefits of one sort or another over the last 20 years. And the system's obviously changed over that period. But they said the stress and strain on mental and physical health of having to go to those appointments with work coaches, and it wasn't that they didn't want to work, it was just some days they were so low they couldn't get out of bed, and they didn't want to ring the job centre and you know, say, I'm really sorry, I can't come in, I'm just feeling too stressed, overwhelmed. And so that could be a month or 3 months or 6 months of their benefits being docked, and then that's obviously just puts people into an ever more downward spiral. So I think there is a consensus in the party that conditionality is harmful. And I think that's a big step. I think there are perhaps more centre-right leaning members of the party, perhaps a little bit older, who say, you know, we can't either politically or ideologically go for that. And, you know, and I respect that, but I think the world and the party is in a slightly different place. I think where the real tricky work for the party and the Federal Policy Committee going forward is probably, where do you set that level of income? And that's, I think, going to draw upon not just UBI advocates, but I think it also, you know, it will be a fair chunk of government spending when it comes to look at our next manifesto, for example. And so I understand that people want to be cautious. You know, I know Ed in particular has talked about, well, you know, effectively you build up a sovereign wealth fund over time to pay for it, but sovereign wealth funds take a long time to pay for things. I mean, you just look at Norway and the way they were very clever and foresighted in the 70s to get the income from North Sea oil to kind of start, you know, putting away for, you know, to make sure public services could be properly paid for. So it take a long time, and I just don't think that, having said we're in favour of UBI and we're going to campaign for it and we'll put it on some leaflets, and then everyone will go, well, how much is it going to be? And we go, well, we don't know yet. So I hope the work is done quickly, but I think it also has to draw on a lot of people in the party, because I think if we set it just at the current level of universal credit or treat it as a top-up, people will be disappointed, I think, amongst those, whatever it was, 800 or 900 people who voted for it in that motion, who obviously it's a smaller number of members out of our total membership, but they're people who do hold UBI very dear, and increasingly so. So we do need to be careful not to push those people away by getting this wrong.
I think that's right. The COVID situation has that's a really weird thing to say. Hold on. I think what's happened with COVID has really moved some people on this issue as well. I think we've seen many people falling through cracks in the system, and I think that's been what's broke the camel's back on the whole issue of conditionality. lots of people have a friend who is self-employed in some way, shape or form that wasn't eligible for some elements of what's available, and they found themselves struggling or having to, I've got friends who've had to move back in with parents, which is always traumatic. And so I think that's a really good thing to come from this, that we've been able to understand that issue so much better. And I think you're absolutely right that the big debate is going to be around the Federal Policy Committee's role in the coming 2-3 years as we shape our future manifesto. So I hope anyone listening to this is really thinking about the future FPC elections, about who might be going for it, and and really be challenging those people on where they stand on this issue, because it's a huge question that's going to be decided there about what this party stands for and what this party is fighting for is its biggest commitment to the next election. I think a bigger commitment financially than any we've ever made in a campaign, at least in the past few decades. So in terms of this question about how much what level we set UBI at, where do you think that should be? What's your first instinct in that space?
Well, I think first of all, it's going to be a tricky thing for the Federal Policy Committee to set. But I think there's some really instructive work that's been done by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and actually the Resolution Foundation have done stuff on this recently as well, which is to look at how much different individuals or families, groups needs in order to basically stay above the poverty line. And they estimate that you probably need £8,000 or £9,000 as a single individual to just make ends meet, to pay for housing, food, all those sorts of things. At the moment, something like universal credit pays, in terms of your living costs, your day-to-day living costs, so not housing, about £4,500 a year. So I think if we look at that and have as members that in our mind, at the moment we effectively say our welfare state should pay people half the money they need to live above the poverty line. I think that gives us a basis to have maybe a bit more of a conversation about what is and what isn't affordable. And also I think it's important to remember that income tax isn't the only source of tax to raise funds. And you can look at land value tax, you can look at corporation tax, you can look at a wealth tax, you can also do less of some things if we think there are things that the current government does that we don't agree with. So I don't think we should let the economics stand in the way. I think we should take a rational view. And as I say, I think it's more to do maybe with making a cultural change and having a good narrative around that, rather than just looking at the pure economics. Because I think if you looked at the economics of anything, you probably wouldn't get out of bed in the morning.
So final thing I was going to ask you and everybody else I interview in the coming weeks and months, it's kind of hard to ignore that across the small ocean there is another major political event going on. We have this presidential election in the United States, where voters have a choice between sanity and insanity. And we could talk about that for hours and in all sorts of ways. So what I'm instead asking is for one thought, one idea, or one lesson from what's happening over in America that we think we should be taking away from this monumental political event.
Well, I mean, I noted that certainly Joe Biden has talked a lot more about building back better. So, like most Liberal Democrats, I'm sure we're sort of backing him, although we can't vote. But I think actually one of the things I've noticed has been from his campaign. So obviously, until he got to South Carolina, it looked like his campaign had completely collapsed, run into the ground. He'd lost his early lead. And I think what's been really interesting is since he won that primary back in the late spring, the thing he did, and some of this is politics, but I think it's an important lesson, was putting together a joint working group effectively to work with a lot of Bernie Sanders supporters to come up with the platform that was unveiled at the sort of virtual DNC convention. And I think that's instructive for two reasons. One is, I think, in terms of our own recent leadership election, where perhaps the, as it were, the Bernie Sanders-esque figure in Layla of being perhaps the underdog and being seen slightly more left wing didn't win. And I think what's really important for the party on issues like UBI and others is to say, okay, what we need to do is make sure that the party can come together on an issue. Because actually, I think a lot of people will see Ed, who, I worked with, back when I was in the press office, 15 years ago. I think they see him as a credible leader, but perhaps a slightly more safe pair of hands, because of his age, because he's a white man. And I think what we need to do to make sure that we keep our own party invigorated around these sorts of ideas like UBI, but also energize the broader voting public, is to kind of say, it's good to be a safe pair of hands, but you also need those ideas which are not only going to be practical and get money into your pocket and deal with the affordability issues you experience in your own life, but they're also new ideas, and they're ideas for the future. And I think that's really crucial. Whether you're Joe Biden or Ed Davey, you need to not only be credible, but you need to inspire people that there's a brighter future.
Absolutely. And I think there's a really interesting parallel there in terms of Layla's really strong performance with young members and ability to engage lots of young people in the party, much as sort of the left of the Democrats have with Sanders and Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, and the how we can ensure that those members who may be disappointed by the way the leadership election went still feel that they have a voice and a role in the party and in shaping our agenda going forwards. Thank you so much for joining me for this, Paul. It's first of this, hopefully, a long-running series.
Cool. Pleasure. I hope the other ones go well.
Yeah. All right, then. Take care.
All right. Take care. Cheers.
Thank you for listening to this first episode of Build Back Liberal. Next time, I'll be joined by the former MP for Cambridge, Julian Huppert, talking about all things digital. So do subscribe so you don't miss that. Please also comment below or get in touch by the details in the description with your thoughts about this series and what else we need to be talking about in shaping a progressive liberal vision for our party. Take care and stay safe.